Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I've always believed that the quietest places hide the loudest secrets. But I never expected to discover mine in an old apartment in the middle of the city. The building was ancient. Its walls were cracked, the floor creaked with every step I took, and the air smelled like dust and something far older, something that belonged to a time I could never grasp. I had just moved in, escaping the chaos of life, wanting peace, hoping this new place would bring it. The apartment was tiny, 2 rooms, a narrow hallway, a small kitchen with peeling wallpaper. But it was mine, and it had a charm about it. The landlord had warned me that the place had been empty for years, and before that, it had been occupied by an elderly woman who had passed away. No one had lived there since. He had said it with a shrug, as if it was no big deal, but it stuck with me. That first night, as I settled into the worn couch, something in the apartment felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious. No doors slamming. No footsteps in the halls. Just a strange, nagging feeling that something was off. The silence of the apartment felt too thick, as if it were pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to dismiss it. It's just the old building settling, I told myself. But even as I turned on the lamp and flipped through an old book, the air seemed to grow heavier. Then I heard it. A faint creak, like someone was walking across the floor. But the apartment was empty. I stood up, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I shook my head, brushing it off. Probably just the building, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But my skin tingled with an unfamiliar sensation, like I wasn't alone. I walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator door, and took out a bottle of water. The dull hum of the fridge was the only noise, but even that felt too loud in the otherwise silent room. Then, I noticed something strange. The air in the kitchen had shifted. It wasn't the normal cold, stale air of an old apartment. It was something else. Something heavier, almost suffocating. A smell. A faint, musty odor. Not the kind of smell you'd expect from an old building. It was something old, yes, but also something more unsettling. Something that reminded me of forgotten places, places where people didn't go anymore. I looked around, but the kitchen was empty. I stepped back, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My fingers tightened around the bottle, the only thing in the room that felt solid, real. Then, I heard it again. The creak. This time, closer. I froze. Was someone here? I wasn't sure how long I stood there, but when I finally moved again, it was with the most unsettling thought in my mind. I wasn't alone. The smell grew stronger, and as I turned, I thought I saw something, just a flicker, a shadow moving in the corner of my vision. But when I blinked, it was gone. I couldn't explain it. But something was wrong with this place. The atmosphere in the apartment had become thicker with each passing minute, like a pressure I couldn't escape. I turned the lights off and tried to settle back onto the couch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. The air grew colder, and the creaks continued, steady and constant, as if the apartment itself was alive and aware of me. It wasn't long before I heard the whispering. At first, It was so faint that I thought I had imagined it. But as it grew louder, I couldn't deny it anymore. There was a voice. Soft, low, like it was coming from behind the walls. The whispering had a rhythm to it, almost like a lullaby. But it was broken, distorted, as if someone had been singing it for too long in a place too far from the light. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of that apartment and never come back. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my breath grew shallow. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't even bring myself to turn on the lights again. The whispering stopped suddenly, and in that eerie silence, I heard a sound that froze my blood, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But these weren't normal footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and echoed in the empty apartment like they were coming from somewhere far deeper than the walls should have allowed. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and rushed to the door. The hall was dark, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd locked the door behind me. The hairs on my neck prickled as I stood frozen, unable to move, staring at the empty hallway. The whispering started again, this time from deeper within the apartment. I didn't know what was real anymore. I left. But even now, as I write this, I can still hear it. The whispering, the footsteps, the creaks of the old floorboards. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I can smell that musty odor again. I never should have come here. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside the apartment. The night air outside felt somehow safer, despite the eerie silence of the street. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hands trembling, my mind racing with unanswered questions. What had I heard? What had I felt? I was scared, terrified even, but I couldn't leave. I had nowhere else to go. My things were still inside. My life was inside that apartment. It was supposed to be the start of something new, something peaceful. I had wanted to escape, to get away from the noise, the chaos, the feeling of being constantly overwhelmed. But I hadn't come for this. I hadn't come to feel haunted. Eventually, the chill of the night crept deeper into my bones, and I found myself returning to the apartment. My footsteps echoed in the dark hallway as I walked up the stairs, each step a reminder of how alone I felt. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last. But still, I couldn't stop. When I reached the door, it felt different. Like it was watching me. The air around it seemed thick, almost suffocating, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. I unlocked the door with shaking hands, pushing it open slowly. The apartment was exactly how I had left it, or at least it looked that way. The faint smell of mustiness hung in the air, but it wasn't the same as it had been earlier. It had changed. There was something sharper about it now, like something had been disturbed. I stepped inside, and the moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. It felt like walking into a tomb. The silence was deafening. The walls seemed to close in around me, their cracks and imperfections now more pronounced in the dim light. I moved through the apartment cautiously, each step careful, as if I were walking on fragile ground. My gaze flicked from corner to corner, the shadows appearing deeper than they should have been. My breath came on invisible clouds. Despite the fact that the radiator was working, the air should have been warmer. I went to the kitchen, thinking I could calm myself by drinking some water. But as I passed the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door to the small closet at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I left. The faint light from the living room cast a long shadow into the space beyond the door. I approached it cautiously. The air around the closet was unnaturally cold, and the smell of that musty odor grew stronger the closer I got. I gripped the door handle, feeling the chill seep into my fingers, and pulled it open. Nothing. The closet was empty, just as I had expected. But the moment I stepped back, a sound rippled through the air. A low, guttural thud. It was muffled, coming from somewhere deep within the apartment. The walls vibrated ever so slightly, like something heavy had been dropped or moved. I froze. It was coming from the farthest room, the bedroom. My heart lurched in my chest. The sound was too distinct to ignore, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Slowly, I moved toward the bedroom, my footsteps barely making a sound on the creaky floor. My breath was shallow, each inhale shaky as I approached the doorway. And then I heard it again. The whisper. It was different this time. No longer soft and distorted like before, it was clear, too clear. Help me. I stumbled back. My mind refused to process the words, refused to acknowledge what I had just heard. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady myself, but my hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold onto the doorframe. The whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. Help me. Please. Help me. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, the air thick with something unexplainable, suffocating. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, to leave this apartment and never come back. But my legs wouldn't obey. The whispering stopped suddenly. Silence filled the space. And then, the footsteps returned. But this time, they weren't just in the distance. They were closer. They were inside the room with me. I could hear them, slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking directly toward me. Every step felt like it echoed in my skull, making my head spin. My hands pressed against my ears, but the sound wouldn't go away. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I dared to open my eyes, only to find the room empty. There was nothing. No one. Just the same familiar shadows. Yet, I could still feel something, an unnatural presence, lingering in the air like a cold, invisible fog. I wanted to leave, but I knew it would be impossible to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something had always been watching me, hidden behind the walls, in the creaks and whispers. I rushed to the living room, trying to distract myself, to hold on to some semblance of normalcy. But the apartment had transformed. What had once seemed like an ordinary, old space now felt like a prison. The walls were no longer just walls. They were memories. They were something else. I knew then that I was not alone. And I had no idea who, or what, was watching me from the other side. It didn't take long before I realized that I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening in the apartment. The strange noises, the whispering, the feeling of being watched, it was all becoming too overwhelming to push to the back of my mind. But there was more. Something deeper. Something that I couldn't explain but could feel lurking in the corners of my awareness. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining it, that I was simply adjusting to the old building and the silence. After all, it wasn't uncommon for old places to creak and groan. The wind might have caused the strange sounds, and maybe the musty odor was just the result of the apartment's age. I was just overthinking it. But then I heard the voice again. It was louder this time, closer. Not a whisper, but a full sentence. It came from the kitchen, and it was so clear that it sent a chill down my spine. Get out. I stood frozen, my heart racing in my chest, blood pounding in my ears. The apartment seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. My legs felt like they were made of stone. The voice wasn't my imagination. It was real. I knew it. I could feel it vibrating through the floor, vibrating through my very bones. The sound of those words echoed in my mind, growing louder, more demanding with each passing second. Get out. I didn't wait to hear it again. I bolted for the door, my hand grabbing the doorknob with such force that it almost felt like it might break. I flung the door open, not looking back, not daring to glance at the empty hallway. My breath was ragged, my pulse thundering in my ears. I needed air. I needed to get out of this place before I lost my mind completely. But when I stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound was so sharp, so forceful, that it made me jump. I spun around, expecting to see the wind had caused it, but there was no breeze. The hallway was still, silent, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The door didn't just slam. It locked. I knew it instinctively. The weight of it was palpable. I couldn't go back in. I couldn't face it anymore. But something kept me from running. Something pulled me back, like a force stronger than my own fear. I tried to push the thought out of my head, tried to tell myself that it was just the building settling, just a trick of my mind. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong with the apartment. Something that went beyond the physical realm. Something otherworldly. The feeling of being watched never left. It followed me, clinging to my back like a shadow. As I stood in the hallway, I felt it again. That cold, oppressive sensation. I turned around, my eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor, but there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows. But then, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a door that I hadn't noticed before had opened. It wasn't there before. It couldn't have been. There was no way. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. The air around me seemed to thicken, to grow heavier. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave and never come back. But I was frozen, rooted to the spot, my feet unwilling to move. The door was wide open now, and I could see nothing but darkness beyond it. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the doorway. It felt like hours. Maybe it was only minutes. Time seemed to blur in that place. The shadows stretched unnaturally, swallowing up the light from the hallway. And then, slowly, the darkness inside the room shifted. It wasn't just shadows. It was something else. Something more. Something that didn't belong. I could feel it, the presence, pressing on me from all sides. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, and I took a step forward. Then another. I couldn't stop myself. It was as though the room was pulling me in, drawing me closer, and I had no choice but to follow. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to change. It grew colder, but not just cold. It felt like the temperature was plummeting, like the room was breathing, like it had a pulse. When I reached the doorway, I paused. I couldn't see anything clearly, only blackness. But I could feel it. Something was watching me from inside. Something that wasn't human. And then, as I stepped over the threshold, I heard the voice again. But this time, it wasn't from the kitchen. It wasn't from the walls. It was right behind me. Stay. I spun around, my body instinctively recoiling, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty hallway, stretching into the distance. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I felt like I was being suffocated, like the apartment was tightening around me, threatening to crush me under its weight. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped. The darkness in the room seemed to surge forward, filling the hallway, pushing me back. It was like being drawn into the heart of the apartment, into its very soul. The shadows moved, shifting unnaturally, warping around me. The walls seemed to bend and twist, and I could hear faint whispers. No, not whispers, voices. Many voices, overlapping, all of them speaking in languages I didn't understand. They were coming from the walls, from the air itself. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen. My mind was spiraling, unable to make sense of anything. The darkness was all around me now, and the whispers, no, the voices, were growing louder. I could feel them. I could feel their presence. And then, one of the voices broke through the chaos. It was familiar. It was the voice I had heard earlier. Help me. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't know if I was losing my mind. But I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let the apartment take me, take my soul. I had to leave. But as I turned to flee, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that there was no way out. There was nowhere to go. And I was no longer alone. I tried to make sense of what was happening. My mind raced, trying to find logic, trying to force reason into the madness surrounding me. But there was no explanation, no pattern. There was only the suffocating, unrelenting presence that had taken hold of the apartment. The air was thick with it, pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. Every part of me screamed to run, to escape, but my legs refused to obey. It was like the apartment had wrapped its invisible hands around me, keeping me in place. The shadows around me seemed to pulse with life. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were moving. They were alive. I could see them creeping along the walls, twisting and writhing like something trying to break free from the confines of the apartment. And then I heard it again. That whisper. Leave. It came from behind me, as if the walls themselves were speaking. It was deeper now, more urgent, as if the thing behind the walls was begging for release. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway was darker than before. The light from the living room barely reached past the doorframe. It felt like the darkness was creeping, slowly, inexorably, forward. The walls, they were breathing. No, not breathing. They were shifting. The paint was bubbling, peeling away like the skin of something that was alive. I watched in horror as the walls seemed to contract, like they were closing in on me. The space was getting smaller, more confined, as if the apartment itself were swallowing me whole. I tried to move, to get away, but I was rooted to the spot. My legs felt heavy, as if they were stuck in tar. The floor beneath me creaked, groaned, and then a sharp cracking sound echoed through the apartment. I looked down. A crack had appeared in the floorboards. It wasn't just a crack. It was a wound, a jagged tear running from one end of the hallway to the other. The wood was splintered, and something was shifting beneath it. It was like the very foundation of the apartment was alive, and it was starting to stir. The whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping in a chorus of despair. "Help me," they cried. "Get out. Leave. Now." But I couldn't. I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the crack in the floor. It seemed to be pulling me toward it, like a magnet, drawing me closer with each passing second. And then, through the crack, something emerged. At first, it was just a sliver, a dark shape creeping through the opening. But then, it began to grow. Slowly, it rose, pushing against the wooden planks, and as it did, the floorboards groaned in protest. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. The thing was like nothing I had ever encountered. It was dark, almost inky black, like the shadows themselves had taken form. It seemed to shimmer as if it were made of smoke, yet it was solid, tangible. It moved, slithering out of the crack, stretching upward. It was humanoid, but its shape was all wrong. Its limbs were long, too long, and twisted in unnatural angles. Its skin, if it could even be called skin, was mottled like rotting flesh, and it seemed to writhe as if it were alive in a way that defied all logic. It had no eyes. At least, none that I could see. Instead, where its face should have been, there was a dark, gaping void. The air around it grew colder, and I could feel the temperature plummeting, my breath turning to mist in front of me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth felt dry, my throat constricted with fear. The thing took a step forward, and the floor beneath it buckled. With each movement, the apartment seemed to groan, as if it were alive, too, in pain, suffering beneath the weight of whatever this thing was. It was coming toward me. I backed up, my feet stumbling against the floor, my pulse thundering in my ears. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but my body refused to cooperate. I could feel the apartment closing in on me, trapping me, holding me in place. The thing moved closer, its body shifting and contorting in ways that made my stomach turn. The air around it was thick, heavy with a sense of dread, like the very essence of fear had gathered around it. And then it spoke. "Leave or die." The voice wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It was guttural, distorted, like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. It felt like it was inside my head, reverberating in my bones. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't know if I was hallucinating. But I knew one thing for sure, whatever this thing was, it wasn't something I could fight. It wasn't something I could understand. I had to get out. But when I turned toward the door, the hallway was gone. There was no door. There was no exit. The walls had closed in. The apartment had swallowed the hallway whole. I was trapped. The thing took another step toward me, and with it, the shadows around me grew darker. They seemed to grow in size, to fill the space, pressing in on all sides. I was suffocating. My chest was tight, my vision swimming as panic set in. My hands reached out, grasping for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. Just empty space. It was too much. The apartment, the thing in front of me, the suffocating darkness, everything was too much. I was going to die here. The thought crashed into my mind, and in that moment, I realized something far worse than death. I wasn't just trapped in the apartment. I was becoming part of it. The walls, the shadows, the thing, they were all a part of it. The apartment wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding off of fear, feeding off of the people who entered it. And now, it had me. The thing reached out, its long, twisted fingers stretching toward me, its body slithering closer. The darkness was overwhelming now, suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see. My body went numb, my legs giving out beneath me. I fell to the floor, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time felt like it had stopped, like the world had turned off for a moment, leaving me suspended in darkness. My body ached, my chest tight, and there was a constant ringing in my ears. The air smelled stale, damp, and thick, like I was breathing in the very essence of decay. I slowly opened my eyes, the world around me spinning. I was lying on the floor. The floor? My surroundings seemed unfamiliar. The hallway, the kitchen, the living room, it was all wrong. I could feel the ground beneath me shifting. The floorboards creaked, groaned, as if something was moving beneath them. I pushed myself up slowly, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of where I was. My hands were shaking, my breath uneven as I tried to push the remnants of sleep from my mind. The apartment felt different. Warmer, almost. The oppressive cold had lifted, but something else lingered in the air. A sense of unease, a sense that I wasn't alone. My senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the stillness. The walls, the floor, it all seemed alive. The shadows were gone, but the whispers, those were still there. They weren't loud, not like before, but they were persistent. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to swirl around me, as though the apartment was speaking in hushed tones. I staggered to my feet, looking around. My body felt heavy, like I was walking through water. My clothes were damp, clinging to my skin, and my hair was matted against my forehead. I couldn't remember what had happened. The last thing I recalled was that thing, the creature, and the overwhelming darkness that had consumed me. Had I dreamed it all? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was the apartment feeding on me? I looked down at the floor, and that's when I saw it. There, in the corner of the room, the floorboards were warped, pushed up in places like something was trying to escape from beneath. The cracks were wider now, jagged, and there was a faint smell, sour and metallic, wafting from them. Something had been there. Something had been waiting beneath the surface, and it had gotten to me. I took a cautious step forward, my body trembling with dread. The floor felt different under my feet, like it wasn't just wood anymore. It was softer, almost spongy, as if there was something else hidden beneath it, something unnatural. I knelt down, pressing my hands against the warped boards. My fingers trembled as I traced the cracks, trying to find the source. The whispers were growing louder now, the voices more distinct. They were no longer just murmurs, they were words, pleading words. Help us. The words sent a shiver down my spine. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It was something else. Something trapped. I could feel it, a presence pressing against the floorboards, trying to get out. I wasn't imagining it. The apartment had a pulse. It was alive. And it was begging for help, or maybe it was begging for something else. Without thinking, my hands gripped the edges of the warped floorboards. I pulled at them, prying them loose with all the strength I had. The sound of it snapping echoed in the silent room, and for a moment, I thought I had made a mistake. I should have stopped. But it was too late. The floorboard came free with a sharp crack, revealing a dark void beneath it. A narrow space, almost like a crawl space, was hidden underneath the apartment's floor. It was black, pitch black, as if light couldn't exist there. A cold breeze rushed up from the hole, and I recoiled, shivering. The smell was overwhelming now, like rot, like something long dead. But there was something else beneath the stench. Something metallic, something familiar. I couldn't explain why, but I leaned closer, drawn to the void. The whispers were louder now, frantic, desperate. The voices were coming from below, and they were speaking to me, urging me to come closer, to see the truth. I reached into the hole, my hand trembling as I touched the cold, damp floor beneath the apartment. My fingers brushed against something soft. Something alive. My heart skipped a beat. It was a body. No, not a body, a mass. A tangle of limbs, twisted and contorted, covered in something dark, slick, and warm. I yanked my hand back, horrified, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. The mass in the hole shifted. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, panic setting in. The creature, the thing beneath the floor, was moving. I could feel it stirring, the apartment groaning as if it were in pain, as if it had been wounded. The thing was alive, and it had been waiting for someone to uncover its secret. The whispers continued, and now they weren't just pleading. They were angry. "Don't leave us," they hissed. "Don't leave us here." I couldn't look. I couldn't bear to see whatever was trapped below the floorboards. But I knew one thing for certain: this place, this apartment, was not just haunted. It was something much worse. It was a prison. A trap. The thing beneath the floor was alive, but so was the apartment. It was feeding off its inhabitants, drawing them in, trapping them within its walls. The voices, the creatures, everything, it had been waiting. Waiting for me. For anyone who dared to enter. And now I understood. This place, this apartment, wasn't just a building. It was a living entity, feeding on fear, on desperation, on death. And it wouldn't let me go. I had already become a part of it. There was no escape. Not now. It was that moment, in the stillness of the night, when I first realized that something had shifted. A small, unnoticeable change, perhaps, but it was enough to make me feel wrong. Like I was no longer where I belonged. The air was thicker, the world outside quieter, as if the night itself was holding its breath. How do you explain it? That eerie sense of being watched, even when you're alone. A feeling that crawls up your spine, cold and prickling. That is how I knew something was different that night. But even as I tell you this, I wonder if I'm just losing my mind. I was sitting in my apartment, the soft hum of the city outside muffling any real noise. I had just finished a late dinner, something quick, nothing special. The lights of the city were like dim stars through my window. And yet, despite the familiarity of the setting, something was off. I couldn't place it, but it tugged at the back of my mind, gnawing at my thoughts. The shadows in my room seemed deeper. My apartment, this place I had lived in for years, felt suddenly foreign. It was as if the walls themselves were shifting around me, stretching out into unknown corners of reality. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the edges of my vision. And then it happened. The sound. A creak. It came from behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. There was nothing there. Nothing I could see. But the sound, it wasn't the usual sounds of an old building settling. This was different. It was deliberate. And it was loud. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Only the empty, silent space of my living room. Just the house, I whispered to myself. But even as I said it, I felt a coldness creeping into my chest. I turned back to face the window, hoping the city's lights would offer some comfort, but instead, I was met with a strange sight. The street lights outside flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye. A movement, quick, almost imperceptible. My breath quickened. I stood up, the floorboards beneath my feet groaning under my weight. A sense of dread began to crawl up from my stomach, spreading through my limbs. The air was heavier now, thick with something I couldn't identify. My skin prickled. I tried to shake it off. Tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'm just tired, I told myself, reaching for the light switch. The soft click of the bulb as it flickered to life offered some relief. But it didn't last. The shadows didn't recede. They remained even under the artificial light. They were watching. That's why I felt it. A presence just behind me, so close I could almost hear its breath. I spun around, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing. There was nothing there. But it didn't matter. I felt it. Something, or someone, was watching me. The sensation crawled up my neck, gripping me with icy fingers. Was it just my mind playing tricks? Was I imagining things? I tried to convince myself of that, but there was something undeniably wrong. It wasn't just the shadows. It was the air. The silence. The way the space around me felt alive, pulsing with an energy that I couldn't comprehend. The creak came again, this time louder. I turned quickly, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. The sound was coming from inside the walls now. Not from outside. Not from the apartment next door. It was here. Closer. Who's there? I whispered, my voice hoarse. No answer. Only the heavy, oppressive silence. Then it came. A whisper. It was barely audible, but I heard it. Just a faint murmur, like a voice carried by the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was in the room with me. The walls, they were speaking. My body froze. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a low hum, a vibration in the air, like the building itself was alive, and it was trying to reach out to me. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was happening to me. The world was shifting, bending in ways I couldn't understand. I could feel the reality I once knew slipping away, like sand running through my fingers. Everything I had known, everything I had believed, was dissolving. I reached for the door, desperate to leave. But as my fingers touched the handle, the whisper grew louder. More insistent. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in like they were trying to consume me. I pulled open the door, stumbling into the hallway. But even there, things felt different. The air was colder, the hallway stretched farther than it should have. The light from the apartment seemed to fade behind me, and the shadows grew longer, darker. What was happening? Why was everything changing? The walls of the building groaned, as if alive. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, like it could give way at any moment. My thoughts were racing, my mind swirling with questions I couldn't answer. Was this real? Or was I losing my grip on reality? I didn't know what was happening. But I knew one thing for sure, the night had changed everything. And there was no going back. The hallway seemed to stretch out before me like an endless tunnel, its walls pulsating with an unsettling rhythm, as if the very structure of the building was breathing. My feet dragged, each step heavier than the last. The silence, so complete and suffocating, was deafening. The usual hum of life outside the building was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that felt unnatural, wrong. My fingers tightened around the door handle, as if it could offer me some form of escape, some relief from the ever-deepening sense of dread that gripped me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, someone, lurking in the corner of my vision. But there was nothing. Just darkness, creeping into every crevice. Yet, I could still feel it. The weight of being watched. The cold chill that seemed to follow me, like a shadow with a life of its own. The air smelled different now, sharper, heavier. It was as if the building had absorbed something old and forgotten. It didn't smell like dust or mildew, it was something else. Something metallic, almost sickly sweet, that made my stomach turn. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The building was old, pipes and walls making strange noises. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The air felt like it was closing in, thickening, suffocating. I moved cautiously, my steps tentative, trying to force my mind to focus on something, anything, other than the gnawing sense of dread that seemed to grow with each passing second. But the darkness seemed to shift around me, like it was alive in a way that made my skin crawl. A soft whisper slid through the silence. Just a murmur. So faint I almost thought I imagined it. Almost. I stopped. My body tensed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My heart raced. It wasn't just the sound of the whisper that terrified me. It was the fact that it was coming from inside the walls. The floor beneath me creaked under my weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the thick silence. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the hallway. The light above flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to twitch and shift on their own. The space around me felt distorted, as though the hallway was stretching out of proportion, bending like a twisted reflection in a funhouse mirror. Was I losing my mind? The thought gnawed at me, but I couldn't dismiss it. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just my imagination playing tricks. Something was happening. Something was here. And it was getting closer. The whisper came again, louder this time. A low, guttural murmur that seemed to reverberate through the walls. I could feel it in my chest, like the building itself was vibrating, sending the sound directly into my bones. I could hear it now, clearer. Words. Not just random noise, but a voice. Low, insistent. Unfamiliar. Leave now. The words seemed to seep into my mind, an invitation to run. A command. But I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor, frozen in place by the unseen force that held me there. I tried to take a breath, but it was as though the air had been sucked out of the hallway. My lungs ached with the effort, and I stumbled back against the wall, clutching it for support. The faint scent of that strange metallic odor grew stronger, thickening in the air, making it harder to breathe. The whisper became clearer, louder, and now it wasn't just one voice. There were others. Low, distorted, overlapping voices that seemed to echo from all directions, surrounding me. The walls closed in, and the hallway stretched farther than it should have. The distance between the end of the hall and where I stood seemed endless. Get out, before it's too late. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My mind was clouded with fear, the terror of what I didn't understand. The oppressive weight of the air, the voices that seemed to come from nowhere, the shifting shadows that no longer belonged to reality, it all felt too much. I could feel the walls tightening around me, pressing in. The building was alive. No, this place was alive. And then, in the middle of the growing chaos, I saw it. A shadow, not quite right. It wasn't the usual distortion of light and dark. This shadow moved against the natural rhythm of the light, stretching and bending unnaturally. It was more than just a shadow, it was a presence. I tried to back away, but my feet refused to move. I couldn't take my eyes off it, but I knew I shouldn't look. It was coming toward me. The darkness seemed to pool in the center of the hallway, thickening, swirling like ink spreading through water. The shape in the shadows slowly began to take form, stretching upward. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, loomed over me, its shape indistinct, but its presence overwhelming. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling degree. I could see my breath misting in front of me, but it didn't bring any comfort. Instead, it made the figure in the shadows clearer, sharper, like the mist was revealing something that shouldn't have been seen. A face, no, not a face, but the faint impression of one emerged from the swirling darkness. It was distorted, formless, like a mask that had been left to rot. Eyes that weren't quite eyes. A mouth that wasn't quite a mouth. But it was there, watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my throat felt dry. My limbs were frozen in place, bound by the weight of the thing standing before me. I didn't understand what it was, or how it could be. But I knew one thing. It wasn't from this world. The whisper came again, louder now, as if it was the voice of the figure itself. Leave, before it takes you. It was all too much. I had to move. I had to escape. But my feet wouldn't move. And in that moment, I realized something else. It wasn't just the building that was alive. I was trapped. And there was no way out. The world around me was spinning. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to understand what was happening. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and every breath felt like it was being sucked out of me, as though the very air in the hallway was being compressed by some unseen force. The figure in the shadows loomed closer, the chilling presence wrapping around me like a vice. I couldn't see its eyes clearly. No, it didn't have eyes. It was something else, something beyond my understanding. Its form flickered, like a glitch in reality itself. The darkness was alive, I realized. It moved, and it was watching, waiting for me to make the first move. But what move could I make? How could I run when I couldn't even move? My mind raced. I tried to force my legs to work, to step back, to flee, but the floor seemed to push against me, holding me in place, as though the building itself was trying to keep me there. The walls around me had grown tighter, the air thicker, like it was crushing me with its weight. The shadow grew in size, its edges becoming sharper, more defined, as though it was gaining substance. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice was lost in the suffocating silence. I couldn't even hear my own breath, only the sound of my pulse racing in my ears. The whispers, the voices, kept echoing around me, louder now, a chorus of distorted, guttural sounds that twisted into a language I couldn't understand. The voices weren't asking me to leave anymore. They were telling me what would happen if I didn't. Too late for you. The words cut through the silence like a blade, each syllable carrying the weight of something ancient, something beyond the reaches of time. A warning? or a promise? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Whatever this thing was, it had been waiting for me. It had always been waiting. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, the cold so sharp it bit into my skin. The air felt like ice, heavy and suffocating. I could see the mist of my breath now, more clearly than before, but it wasn't comforting. It was as though the cold was crawling into me, twisting itself into my very bones, filling me with a deep, primal fear that was hard to shake. The figure moved again, slowly, its unnatural form stretching toward me. The shadows around it seemed to bend, merging with the walls, reaching for me as though trying to pull me into the darkness. My stomach churned. This wasn't just fear. This was something deeper, something that made me feel as though I was being erased from existence. The very essence of me, my identity, my memories, felt like they were slipping away, fading into the cold, black void. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, like I had been holding my breath for too long. My body felt heavy, like I was sinking into the floor, the walls closing in, and that thing, that presence, was getting closer. Its shape was becoming more defined now, the darkness forming into something more corporeal. Its outline was jagged, like a broken mirror, flickering in and out of existence. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It felt like it was part of me, like its existence was bound to mine. There was no escape. In that moment, everything I had known, everything I had believed about the world, shattered. The hallway, the building, it wasn't real anymore. It was just an illusion, a mask hiding something far darker, something that was now staring back at me from the abyss. And I was just a part of it. A piece of the puzzle. I felt the weight of its presence pushing against my mind, invading my thoughts. It was reading me, searching my past, my fears, and twisting them into something new, something horrific. I saw flashes, memories, but distorted. Faces of people I once knew, now twisted and unrecognizable. Images of places I had been, now corrupted, warped. The past was no longer solid, it was fluid, shifting, like the room around me. But then, a strange sensation overcame me. A feeling of detachment. It was as if I were no longer in my own body. I watched my own movements, my own fear, from the outside, as though I were a spectator in my own life. The shadow stretched out toward me, its tendrils reaching, wrapping around my body, pulling me closer. It wasn't touching me, not in the way I understood it. It was sinking into me, becoming part of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel the crushing weight of its presence, suffocating every thought, every emotion. And then, in the midst of this suffocating darkness, I heard something new. A sound. A voice, but not the whispers. Not the darkness. This voice was familiar. It was mine. Wake up. It wasn't a whisper. It was a command. And it hit me like a thunderclap. I gasped, a sharp intake of air, as if I had been underwater for far too long. My body jerked as though waking from a deep, nightmare-ridden sleep. I tried to move, tried to break free from the thing that was holding me. But I couldn't. The pressure on my chest increased, as if the darkness itself had a grip on me, pulling me further into the void. The walls pressed in, closing in tighter and tighter, until there was no more room. No more air. No more light. I was trapped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as I thought I might be swallowed whole, the world shifted. The hallway warped again. But this time, it wasn't the same distorted, twisting reality I had been experiencing. This time, the space stretched too far. It became too wide. The walls opened, and a flood of cold, harsh light poured in, blinding me. I shielded my eyes, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it was too much. Too bright. Too sudden. And then I heard it. A sound. A bang. A loud, earth-shattering bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large falling to the ground, shaking the very foundation beneath me. It was real. And then, everything went dark. I woke with a jolt, my body stiff and cold. My breath came in shallow, frantic gasps as if I had just surfaced from the deepest ocean. But there was no ocean here. Only the suffocating silence that hung in the air, thick and oppressive, like a blanket of dread. I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust my vision, but everything was blurred, my surroundings a swirl of shadows and light. The sound, the bang, the fall, still echoed in my ears, but it was fading now, as though the world had swallowed it up, leaving me with only the lingering tremor in the ground beneath me. I was lying on the floor, my back pressed against the cold, rough surface. My fingers dug into the carpet as if anchoring myself to something solid. I needed something solid. Something real. I forced myself to sit up, every movement slow and deliberate, as if my body was unsure of what it should do next. The room around me felt wrong, out of place. It didn't look like the hallway I had been standing in just moments ago. It wasn't even my apartment. The walls were too far apart, the ceiling too high. The dim, flickering light above me cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in ways that defied logic. The air smelled stale, musty, like an old, abandoned place. The same scent I had noticed when I first entered the building, only now it was thick, cloying. The scent of something forgotten. I stood shakily, every muscle protesting, my head spinning with 1,000 questions I couldn't answer. Where was I? What had happened? I glanced around, trying to make sense of the space. The walls were cracked and peeling, covered in layers of dust. Furniture sat in disarray, as if someone had hastily abandoned this place. But there were no signs of life. No traces of anything that should have been there. Just emptiness. Then, my gaze fell upon something that sent a chill through my entire body. The floor. There, in the center of the room, was a dark stain, a large blotch that had soaked into the carpet. It wasn't just dirt or spilled liquid. No, this was different. It had the color and texture of something far darker, something I didn't want to think about. Something that felt wrong. A sudden wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled backward, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. I was imagining things, I told myself. It had to be. The stress, the exhaustion, it was all messing with my head. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew something deeper was at play. This place, this room, was not real. It wasn't where I belonged. It was as though the fabric of the world around me was fraying, unraveling, revealing a truth I was not ready to face. I turned around, desperate to find an exit, but there were no windows, no doors. Just the same cold, empty space stretching endlessly in every direction. My heart raced, panic starting to claw at my chest as the weight of isolation settled over me like a heavy cloak. I wasn't alone, though. I could feel it. The presence, the thing that had been waiting, watching. It was still here. I could sense it in the air, thick and suffocating. It pressed against my skin, crawled under my nails, gnawed at the edges of my mind. I took a step forward, my legs unsteady, the ground feeling strange beneath my feet. With each movement, the room seemed to shift slightly, as if the very space itself was alive, bending around me. The walls pulsed faintly, as if they had a heartbeat, a rhythm I couldn't understand but couldn't ignore. A low, guttural sound broke the silence. It wasn't the same whispering voices from before, but something else. A low hum, vibrating through the air like an insect's drone. It was coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but the room was empty, no shadow, no figure. Just the same cold, sterile emptiness. The sound stopped. And then, without warning, a voice, a real voice, a clear one, cut through the tension. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was deep, gravelly, almost mechanical in its tone. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't even a human voice. I looked around frantically, my breath hitching in my throat. The words echoed around me, bouncing off the walls, but there was no one. No one in sight. "You shouldn't have come here," it repeated, closer now, as though the voice was right behind me. But when I turned, there was still no one. I took a step back, my back colliding with the wall. I could feel the roughness of the surface pressing against my spine, grounding me, but at the same time, it made me feel smaller, trapped. The presence was growing stronger, feeding off my fear. The walls seemed to close in, not physically, but in my mind. It was like being suffocated by the very air, a pressure that made it hard to think, to breathe. Suddenly, I felt a shift beneath my feet, the ground beneath me vibrating, and I stumbled forward, nearly falling. I caught myself just in time, my hands grasping at the nearest piece of furniture, a chair, trying to steady myself. The hum returned, louder this time, resonating through the floor, the walls, the very air I breathed. Something was happening. Something was waking up. And then, I saw it. A figure, barely visible at first, standing at the far end of the room. It wasn't fully formed, not like a person, but a shifting, distorted shape, like the outline of a human, but made of darkness, its edges blurry, ever-changing. The air grew colder still. I could feel the temperature drop in an instant, my breath coming out in clouds of vapor as the figure stepped forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was struggling to maintain its form. The hum grew louder, and the voice returned, this time louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come here." I wasn't sure if I was ready to face whatever this was. Was it the same presence that had been haunting me, or something worse? Something older? But one thing was certain, the darkness was alive, and it wasn't going to let me leave. Not without a price. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart thundering in my chest. The figure, this shape made of darkness, took a slow, deliberate step toward me. Every motion it made seemed to warp the air around it, twisting the shadows in unnatural ways. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze, cold and suffocating, pressing down on me like 1,000 pounds of weight. My legs trembled. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, anything to escape. But my body refused to obey. I could barely breathe, let alone move. My mind screamed at me to wake up, to make sense of what was happening, but the reality around me was crumbling. Every attempt to grasp onto something solid only made the world feel more like quicksand. The figure spoke again, its voice carrying a malevolent calm that made my skin crawl. "You should never have entered this place." It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the words were etched into the very walls, the floor, the air around me. The weight of those words pressed in on me, wrapping themselves around my chest like a vice. I couldn't escape it. I wanted to understand. What was this thing? Why was it speaking to me? What did it want? But there were no answers, only the suffocating silence that followed its words, like the calm before the storm. The temperature had dropped even further, my breath now visible in front of me, each exhale like a puff of smoke. I felt myself shiver uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from the gnawing fear creeping through every fiber of my being. It took another step forward, its form shifting, becoming less like a shape and more like a void, as if it existed outside of this world entirely. My eyes struggled to focus, my mind battling to piece together something that made sense. The longer I stared, the more distorted the figure became, as though it was pulling at the very fabric of reality. Suddenly, the room around me seemed to pulse, the walls expanding and contracting like the beat of a heart. The sound of the hum intensified, vibrating through my bones, rattling my teeth. The air tasted bitter, heavy with something I couldn't identify but knew instinctively was wrong. I couldn't keep looking at it. I had to look away. But every time I tried to turn, my gaze was drawn back to the figure. There was no escaping it. It was inside me, behind my eyes, pressing into my thoughts. "You cannot leave," it said. "Not unless you understand the price." The price? What did it mean? My mind raced, desperate to make sense of the words, but nothing made sense anymore. Everything I thought I knew about reality, about myself, about this world, was slipping through my fingers. I couldn't tell if this was a nightmare I was trapped in or if I had crossed into something far worse. The figure moved again, its shape swirling like smoke, and I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest. It wasn't physical, at least not in any way I could explain, but it was there, like a pressure building inside me, tightening with every passing second. My vision blurred, and I gasped, my hands clutching my chest as though I could hold whatever it was inside. The figure's voice continued, its words now flowing together in a low, endless chant. "The price of silence is more than you can bear." I couldn't understand what it meant. I couldn't comprehend the significance of its words. But deep down, I knew that whatever this was, whatever this thing was, it had been waiting for me. It had been watching me, following me, perhaps even from the moment I had first entered this cursed building. I was the one who had allowed it in. And now I would pay the price. The pain inside me flared again, sharper this time, as though something was clawing its way out. I gasped, my breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. My body swayed, struggling to stay upright. The walls seemed to collapse inward, the shadows thickening until they swallowed the light completely. The air was no longer just cold, it was suffocating, heavy with the weight of all the things I didn't understand. "Do you hear it?" the figure asked. Its voice was barely a whisper now, though I could still feel it vibrating through me, inside me. The silence, the price of silence. And then I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like the fluttering of wings or the whisper of 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. It grew louder, more distinct, until the sound seemed to fill the entire room, drowning out everything else. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat feeling like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. I tried to move, to find some escape, but my legs were like lead. My body was numb, my limbs refusing to cooperate. I wanted to scream, but my mouth was dry, unable to form the words. The room was no longer still. It was alive, the shadows swirling, the walls contracting and expanding like the beating of a heart. The figure was no longer a shape, but a mass of darkness, swirling and twisting like it was feeding on the very air around it. I could feel it drawing closer, its presence pressing in on me from all sides. The price of silence. It whispered again, and this time I understood. It wasn't just the silence of the room, the stillness in the air. No, it was the silence inside me, the quiet, the numbness that had followed me all my life, the way I had ignored the things that haunted me, the way I had turned a blind eye to the darkness within myself. I had been silent for too long, and now the silence was coming for me. I had no escape. The price had been set, and I was the one who would pay. Have you ever seen a shadow move on its own? It's a simple question, isn't it? Something you might dismiss in the blink of an eye. But once you see it, once you truly see it, nothing is ever the same again. The kitchen was quiet that evening, a kind of silence that can only be found in the stillness of night. It was one of those quiet nights where the hum of the refrigerator is the loudest sound and the world outside seems to fall away. The only light in the room came from the dim overhead bulb, casting long, slow shadows across the walls and counters. I was standing by the sink, rinsing a few dishes, when I saw it. A shadow, long and thin, stretching out from the faucet on the wall. But here's the thing, it shouldn't have been moving. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe the bulb was flickering, or the shadows were playing tricks on me. I turned away quickly, telling myself it was nothing. Just my mind getting the best of me. I'm sure you felt it too, those moments when something feels off, but you don't know why. When your mind starts to fill in the gaps with ideas you'd rather ignore. But then the shadow shifted again. It wasn't a smooth, natural movement like you'd expect from a normal shadow cast by a light source. No, this was different. It stretched, warped, and twisted as if it were alive, as if it were trying to reach for something. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, my eyes fixed on the faucet, my heart thumping louder than it ever had before. I was sure of one thing in that moment, the shadow was moving toward me. I stepped back, instinctively, as though putting distance between myself and whatever was happening in front of me. The kitchen, the place where I cooked dinner countless times, the place I thought I knew better than any other, suddenly felt foreign. The walls seemed to close in, and the faintest sound of dripping water echoed in my ears. But even that wasn't normal. The faucet had stopped leaking days ago. I had checked. A cold chill spread down my spine as I turned my gaze from the shadow to the sink. The faucet was still, no water flowing, yet the shadow seemed to stretch further, like a dark hand creeping out from the wall. I blinked. Once. Twice. It didn't disappear. The shadow lingered, twisting in slow, deliberate motions, as if it were trying to communicate something I couldn't quite grasp. But in the pit of my stomach, I felt it, that gnawing sensation that something was wrong, something was very wrong. I leaned in closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. My breath was shallow, my pulse quickening as I squinted at the movement. It was almost as if it were mocking me. The shadow wasn't just a shadow anymore, it had taken on a shape, a form that seemed to have substance, like it was no longer bound by the rules of light and dark. Then I heard it. A faint, low hum. So soft at first that I thought it was just the sound of my own nerves reacting to the unsettling sight. But no! It grew louder, a vibrating hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It seemed to echo inside my skull, pressing against my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I stepped back again, but this time my legs felt weak. My head spun as the kitchen swirled around me. The hum grew louder, more insistent. It vibrated through the floor, through my body, filling the air with an unnatural energy. The shadow in the corner of my vision twisted faster, as though something invisible was moving behind it. Something alive. Is this real? I whispered, my voice shaking. Am I imagining this? But I knew I wasn't. My gaze locked onto the faucet, my eyes burning from the intensity of my stare. I could feel it then, a shift in the air, a pressure. Something was watching me. I could almost feel its presence, like the very walls of the kitchen had become a cage. The familiar had turned foreign. My own home no longer felt like my own. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart racing, my breath ragged. The shadow had stopped moving for the moment, but the air was still thick with an oppressive sense of wrongness. I tried to look away, to tell myself that I was just tired, just seeing things. But I couldn't. The shadow, it was still there. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting. Waiting for me to do something. Waiting for me to make the next move. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. But as I turned to leave, something stopped me. The faucet. The water started again. A soft trickle at first, then it grew louder, more pronounced. The sound of water running, except there was no reason for it to be on. The faucet had been turned off. My heart skipped a beat as the room began to spin, as the shadow in the corner of my eye began to stretch again, slowly, deliberately. And that's when I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper. Not a hum. But a voice, clear, deep, and unmistakably real. You shouldn't have seen that. I froze, the words sinking into my skin like cold, jagged knives. The voice was not just in my ears, it was inside my head, curling around my thoughts, feeding on my fear. My breath hitched as the shadow grew larger, stretching toward me, pulling me in. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I ran because I knew one thing for certain, whatever was in my kitchen was not supposed to be there. And it wasn't going to let me go. I could hear it behind me, the sound of something dragging itself across the floor, an unnatural scraping that echoed in the silence of my home. Each step I took felt like it was slower than the last, my legs heavy with fear. My breath came in ragged gasps as I rushed toward the door, my fingers trembling as I fumbled for the handle. But it wouldn't open. The kitchen, the place that once felt like a safe haven, had transformed into something else entirely. The air was thick, suffocating, as if it were pressing in on me from all sides. I could still hear the water running, that steady trickle that had become something far more sinister. I turned, unwillingly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shadow had changed, shifted somehow. It was no longer a simple blotch on the wall. It had form. A vague, formless shape that seemed to reach toward me, hungry and relentless. It was as if it had its own will, its own mind, and it was coming for me. I tried again to open the door, panic clawing at my chest. The handle wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The faucet, the water, the voice, everything had felt like a dream. But now, it felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. You shouldn't have seen that. The voice echoed again, this time closer, clearer, like it was right next to my ear. My skin prickled, and I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the empty kitchen. The shadows. The hum. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The door, I had to get out through the door. With all my might, I shoved against the handle again. This time, it gave way. I bolted into the hallway, my breath ragged as I sprinted toward the front door. My mind raced. I needed to leave. I had to get out. The hallway, which had always seemed so normal, now seemed narrow, oppressive. The walls closed in around me, and the air felt heavier with every step I took. The sound of the faucet running echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that whatever was following me was close. I didn't dare turn around, afraid of what I might see. But I knew it was there. I could feel its presence behind me, just out of sight. Something dark. Something that shouldn't have been. I reached the front door and yanked at the handle. It was locked. Of course it was locked. My fingers flew over the cold metal, trying to find the key. My mind was a blur. I couldn't remember the last time I'd locked it. I couldn't think. I couldn't. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They weren't my own. I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the hall, stood the silhouette of a figure. I couldn't make out its features, only a dark outline, tall and shadowed. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands slick with sweat. It was here. The thing that had been in the kitchen. The thing that had been waiting. My pulse hammered in my ears as I backed away, my mind racing. What was it? Was it real? Was I losing my mind? The figure stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath its weight, and for the first time, I saw something that froze me in place, its hands. They weren't human. Long, spindly fingers that stretched too far, too impossibly long as they reached toward me. And then it spoke. You shouldn't have seen me. Its voice was low, almost soothing, but the words felt like ice in my veins. My legs refused to move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't. You were never meant to see me. The voice wasn't just coming from it anymore. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It surrounded me. The walls felt like they were closing in. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I could taste the fear on the back of my tongue. And then, as if it were simply too much to bear, the thing moved. It wasn't a step. It wasn't a lunge. It was a flicker, a blur of movement so fast I couldn't comprehend it. One moment, it was at the end of the hall, and the next, right in front of me. My body screamed for me to run, but my legs didn't respond. I was frozen. Trapped. Its eyes were empty. Dark pits that seemed to swallow light. No pupils. No irises. Just darkness. It reached out with those long fingers, and my body jolted forward, not because I had moved, but because it had grabbed me. Its grip was cold, unnatural, like metal against my skin, like death itself was closing around me. Why? I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what I was asking, but I needed to hear it. Needed to understand what this thing was, what it wanted from me. The creature's lips curled into something that could have been a smile. But there was no joy in it, only malice. Because you saw me. And then everything went dark. I woke up in my own bed. At least, I thought I did. The room looked the same. The walls were where they should be. The furniture, the light from the window. It was all too perfect, too still. But something was wrong. My hands were shaking. My heart was still racing. I wasn't sure if the events of last night had been a dream, a hallucination, or if they had been real. But I didn't need to know. All I knew was that the shadow, the figure, the voice, it was still in my mind. Waiting. Watching. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard it again. You shouldn't have seen me. But this time, it didn't come from the walls. It didn't come from the shadows. It came from right behind me. I turned slowly, my body frozen in a terror I couldn't quite explain. The room, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt alien, foreign, as though it had been twisted by something unseen, something that shouldn't have been there. The air itself felt heavier, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to crawl along the edges of the walls, stretching toward me with an unnerving slowness. It was standing there. Not the same thing that had confronted me in the hallway, but something equally wrong. I could feel its presence, its intensity, without even having to look directly at it. My mind refused to acknowledge what I was seeing, yet my senses screamed that it was real. A figure, not quite human, but close enough to remind me of everything that I feared. A silhouette, dark and unnatural, standing at the foot of my bed. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I tried to move, to speak, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct screamed at me to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there in silence. For a moment, everything was still. And then, the figure shifted. The motion was fluid, unnerving. It wasn't a human-like movement. There was no grace, no rhythm to it. It was as if the being simply glided, disjointed and unnatural, as though the laws of reality no longer applied to it. It was getting closer. I tried to speak, but my voice was caught in my throat. My pulse raced faster with each passing second. The figure was inches from me now, and the smell of something rotting, something decayed, filled the air. The stench was suffocating. My stomach turned. The figure didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to suffocate any remaining sense of reality I had left. Its form seemed to shift with every breath I took, like a shadow pulled by some invisible force, twisting and turning as though it were not part of this world. I tried to blink, to clear my vision, to convince myself that it was all some horrific hallucination. But the thing didn't fade. It didn't disappear. It stayed. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, were dark voids, blacker than the night itself, like a bottomless pit that seemed to pull at everything it touched. And then it spoke again. You can't escape me. The voice came not from its mouth, but from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air around me. It vibrated in my bones, in my very soul. The sound twisted, warping into something incomprehensible, something that felt like it was scraping at the edges of my sanity. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't form. I was trapped. The figure loomed over me, and I couldn't breathe. My chest felt as though it was being crushed by an unseen weight. It knew me. It knew everything about me, everything I had ever feared, and now it was going to make me face it. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence expanding, filling the room, suffocating me. It was like being trapped in the middle of a storm. Everything around me was swirling in chaos, and I was powerless to stop it. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, any way to escape. But there was no escape. I knew it now. This wasn't a dream, this wasn't a hallucination. It was real. The thing in front of me was real, and it was only getting closer. You shouldn't have seen me, it whispered again, its voice thick with something dark, something ancient. Now you're mine. I wanted to shout, to do something, anything, to break free from the hold it had over me. But all I could do was stand there, helpless, as the darkness consumed me. Suddenly, everything went black. When I woke up again, I was no longer in my bed. I wasn't even in my apartment. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No hum of appliances, no creak of floorboards, just an empty, suffocating quiet that pressed down on me like a weight. I sat up quickly, my head spinning as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The room I was in was dimly lit, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper that smelled faintly of mildew. The air was thick, and the floor beneath me felt cold, too cold, like it had been abandoned for years. I tried to push myself to my feet, but my legs felt weak, like they were no longer working properly. I stumbled, reaching out for support, but there was nothing to grab hold of. The room was devoid of any furniture, any familiar markers of reality. It was just empty space, stretching out into endless shadows. I could hear it now. The faucet. The sound of water running, distant and faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere in the darkness. I couldn't tell where, but I could feel it drawing me in, pulling me toward it. I had to find a way out. I forced myself to move, dragging my feet across the cold floor, my mind a chaotic mess of panic and disbelief. Where was I? How had I gotten here? What was happening to me? The walls seemed to shift and change as I walked, like they were closing in on me, warping in ways that didn't make sense. And then, from the shadows, I saw it again. The figure. The one I had thought I left behind. It was standing in the corner of the room, its form as dark and formless as before, its eyes empty and hollow. It didn't move. It just watched. You can't escape me. The voice came again, cold and void of emotion. It was everywhere, filling every corner of the room, vibrating through my skull. I could feel my grip on reality slipping. My thoughts were unraveling, my fear taking over. I wasn't sure if I was awake or if I was lost in some nightmare. But one thing was certain, I couldn't escape. Not now. Not ever. I couldn't breathe. The darkness around me was thickening, suffocating, pressing against my chest like a heavy weight. I could feel it crawling under my skin, worming its way into my thoughts, turning everything inside out. There was no escape. The figure in the corner, still watching, still waiting, seemed to grow, its shape stretching, distorting, until it was a part of the shadows themselves. I could feel its eyes on me, even though there were no eyes, just two endless black voids where nothing but emptiness existed. I took a step back, my mind reeling, my heart pounding in my ears. My legs trembled with the effort to stand, but my body refused to obey. I felt trapped in my own skin, unable to escape the thing that had already ensnared me in its grip. The figure didn't move, but its presence suffused the room like a cold wind that seeped into every crack and crevice, chilling me to my core. You shouldn't have seen me, it whispered, its voice no longer coming from any single point, but rather from the very air around me. It felt as though the room itself had a voice, one that was thick with malice and ancient hatred. I could feel it inside my head now, as if the words were not just spoken, but imprinted, crawling through my thoughts like a virus. I clutched my head, trying to block out the voices, the sounds, but it was impossible. The walls seemed to close in on me, the space around me warping into something unrecognizable. The floor beneath me was no longer solid, but soft, like I was walking through thick mud, and the air, it was alive, buzzing with a low hum that I could feel in my bones. I staggered forward, my eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything, that would help me escape. The faucet, still running, echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the presence in this place. The shadows seemed to grow longer, twisting like dark tendrils, stretching toward me with a menacing slowness. I had to find a way out. But the door, it was gone. The door was gone. The space I had been in, the place that had once felt like my home, was now a nightmare. The walls, the ceiling, everything was shifting and undulating, like the room itself was alive, breathing, watching me. I could no longer trust the space around me. The shadows were not just in the corners anymore, they had come alive. They were everywhere, crawling along the floor, the walls, creeping across the ceiling like dark veins, pulsating with a rhythm I could feel deep inside me. Panic surged through me, flooding my mind with confusion. The fear was overwhelming. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, or if any of it was real. It all felt like a dream, a nightmare that had come to life, blurring the lines between waking and sleeping. I was no longer in control. It was as if the room had taken on a life of its own, its malevolent presence pushing in from all sides, closing off any escape. And then I heard it again. The faucet. The sound of water running. But it wasn't coming from the same direction anymore. It was all around me now, echoing from every corner, from every surface, until it became a maddening symphony of dripping water that filled my ears and rattled my brain. It was as if the water itself had become a creature, one that moved and shifted, changing shape in ways that defied logic. The sound grew louder, sharper, more insistent, until it felt as though it was coming from inside my skull. I turned, my heart racing, my breath shallow, searching desperately for the source of the noise. But there was nothing there. The room, once so familiar, had become an endless void, stretching out into infinity. The shadows twisted, they swirled, and with them came the unmistakable scent, decay, rot, something old. I could taste it on the air now, feel it on my tongue, as if the very essence of the room had been poisoned by its presence. I was losing my grip on reality. My mind was spiraling, descending into madness, and I couldn't stop it. The figure, it was still there. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. But now, it wasn't just watching. It was reaching out to me, its form undulating, stretching toward me like it was made of darkness itself. The room seemed to warp and bend as it advanced, distorting reality around me. The shadows pulled tighter, converging until it felt like the room was shrinking, closing in on me with a slow, suffocating pressure. You're mine. The voice wasn't just in my ears anymore. It was inside me, filling my thoughts, drowning my mind in its cold, unrelenting words. I could feel it in my chest, in my stomach, in every beat of my heart. There was no escape, no hope of freedom. I was trapped. The shadows were pulling me in, and the figure, it was drawing closer, its presence consuming everything, swallowing me whole. I stumbled back, but the ground shifted beneath my feet. The floor felt like quicksand, and the walls, no, the space, seemed to move with me, following my every step. The ceiling was no longer fixed above me, it hung like a black shroud, pulsing with a sickening rhythm. The room was no longer a place I could recognize. It had become something else entirely, something unrecognizable, a dark, infinite abyss. And the sound of the water, now deafening, was everywhere. It felt like it was in my head, in my blood, in my very soul. I collapsed to the floor, clutching my head, my mind splitting in two. My thoughts were no longer my own, and my body felt like it was betraying me, moving against my will, pulled by some invisible force. I couldn't see, I couldn't think, All I could hear was the relentless dripping, the endless whispers, the overwhelming presence of the thing that was with me. It was here. It was real. And there was no escaping it. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The shadows closed in, and I was gone. I didn't know how long I had been lying there, crumpled on the floor, the darkness pressing down on me like 1,000 hands, each one dragging me deeper into an abyss I couldn't comprehend. Time had no meaning anymore. It was all slipping away, my sense of self, my grip on reality. It was as though I had entered a world where the rules didn't apply, where space and time had fractured into an endless nightmare. My body felt heavy, unresponsive, but I was still aware. I could feel the floor beneath me, cool and damp. The air around me was thick with the suffocating smell of rot, of something ancient, of something that should not be. The darkness pulsed. The shadows were everywhere. There were no walls, no windows, just an empty void stretching infinitely in every direction. The silence was unbearable, a silence so profound it was deafening. Yet, beneath it, something moved. The sound of water, the endless drip drip drip, had become my reality, my heartbeat. I could feel it, growing louder, more frantic, as though the water itself was rising, swallowing everything around me, including my thoughts. I wanted to move, to escape, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, my limbs frozen in place, my mind a mess of fragmented thoughts. Panic surged through me, but there was no outlet. The air was too thick, too heavy to breathe. Is this it? That thought echoed in my mind, repeating over and over. Was I already gone? Had the thing in the shadows already claimed me, and this was just the last echo of a fading soul? I wanted to scream again, but my throat was dry, my voice stolen by the darkness that surrounded me. It was as if everything, my body, my voice, my mind, was being consumed by the very air I breathed. Then, a shift in the air, in the sound. The water had stopped. The drip 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 ceased, and in its place, I heard something far worse, a soft, low scraping sound. It was faint at first, like fingernails dragging across wood, but it grew, growing louder, sharper, until it felt as though the sound was coming from everywhere at once. From the walls, from the floor, from inside my own skull. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside me now, a part of me. I could feel the vibrations, a deep, sickening hum that shook my very core. The thing in the shadows was moving. It's here. I wanted to run. I wanted to flee, to escape from the nightmare that had become my reality. But I couldn't. My body remained frozen, trapped in a space that was no longer my own. My heart pounded in my chest, but it felt like the pulse was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deep within the darkness. I could feel it in the walls, in the floor, in the air around me. And then, through the oppressive silence, a whisper. I see you. It was a voice, but it didn't come from anywhere specific. It was everywhere. It wrapped around me like a cold, wet blanket, suffocating me, pushing me further into the depths of terror. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My voice had been stolen. The room began to shift again. The shadows didn't just stretch, they moved, rippling, coiling like snakes, twisting around me in patterns that defied logic. The walls were warping, bending in on themselves, and the air felt alive, thick with an unnatural energy. I could see the outline of the thing in the corner, the figure that had been watching me, waiting. But now, it wasn't just a figure. It was something more. something that defied description. It was shifting, changing, becoming something else entirely. I could feel its presence, pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was getting closer, closer with every passing second, and the longer it stayed, the more it seemed to pull the room apart. The space was collapsing in on itself, like it was being consumed by something beyond time, beyond reason. You shouldn't have seen me. The voice again. Closer this time. It felt like it was inside my mind, speaking directly to me, wrapping its tendrils around my thoughts, squeezing the life out of them. My vision began to blur, my thoughts scattering like pieces of broken glass. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure was no longer a shadow. It was solid, tangible, but it wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent, an entity that had no place in this world, no place in any world. Its shape was amorphous, shifting constantly, but there were eyes, two black, empty voids where its face should have been. Eyes that bore into me, hollow and cold, eyes that saw into the very depths of my soul. You can't escape. The whisper came again, a command this time, not a warning. I felt my body shudder in response, every fiber of my being rejecting the words. I tried to move, but my limbs were still frozen, locked in place by some unseen force. The room continued to twist, bending and stretching in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowered, the floor rose, and all the while, the figure advanced. I was being pulled in, dragged toward it. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The room was still. The shadows were still. The sound of the water was gone. And I was alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone at all. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing. Just an empty, silent room. It felt like the world had shifted around me, and I had been left behind, standing on the edge of something other. Was it real? I didn't know anymore, but I could still feel it. The presence. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it came back. The door was open now, just slightly ajar. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the floor. I didn't know if it was a way out or another trap. But I had no choice. I had to move. And so, I stepped into the hallway. It began with a question. I remember it so clearly, as though the very moment had carved itself into the fabric of my existence. How many times can the same moment repeat before you lose track of time? That was the thought that started everything, the one that lodged itself deep into my mind and began to unravel everything I once knew. I had always been the type to keep track of things, dates, events, the passage of time. But then, something happened, something small at first, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a noise that I couldn't quite place, and I began to notice it, the repetition. The feeling that time, my reality, was being replayed. It wasn't a mere memory, no, it was as though time itself was looping, breaking into shards that I couldn't piece back together. It started in my apartment. A small, quiet place in the city, one I had rented in hopes of finding some peace, some sense of normalcy. I thought the noise was just the wind at first, the creaking of floorboards, the sound of my coffee machine whirring to life. It was a comfort to me, the hum of a routine life, of nothing extraordinary. But as days went on, I began to notice strange little things. Patterns that were too neat, too perfect. One morning, I found myself waking up to the exact same sound, the sound of my neighbor's door creaking open. The same quiet footsteps down the hall, the same ringing of the same phone call at exactly the same time. It seemed impossible, yet it was happening. I brushed it off as coincidence, maybe a trick of my tired mind. But then it happened again. And again. There was no logical explanation for it. I began to question whether I was losing my grip on reality. It wasn't just the small events. The more I thought about it, the more I saw it, the same conversations with friends that seemed to repeat with little change. The same meals eaten in the same order. The same streetlights flickering in the same pattern. Everything was starting to fold in on itself, like I was caught in some kind of endless loop that I couldn't escape. One evening, after a particularly disturbing day of déjà vu, I decided to test it. I went to the grocery store at the exact same time, took the exact same route to get there, and bought the same items I had the day before. Everything was the same. The faces in the crowd, the movements of the cashier, they were all familiar, too familiar. As I walked back to my apartment, the feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming. It was as if the air itself was vibrating, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stopped in the middle of the street, closed my eyes, and tried to focus. I told myself that I was just tired, that I was imagining things. But even as I tried to reassure myself, I heard it. The whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A soft voice, so quiet it could have been the wind, but somehow it wasn't. It was just a word, my name. Adam. I froze. For a moment, I thought it was someone behind me, but when I turned around, the street was empty. Just the same dimly lit pavement and the quiet hum of city life. My heart was racing. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was nothing. But as I neared my building, the whispers continued, growing louder, more persistent. They were all around me, circling like a swarm of flies, but still, I couldn't see anyone. Was this real? I felt the weight of something pressing against my chest as I fumbled with my keys, struggling to unlock the door. The air in my apartment seemed thicker than usual, as though something had changed. The silence, once comforting, now felt like a trap. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows dancing just outside my field of vision. And then it started again. The repetition. The whispers, the sounds, the events. Everything was repeating itself. I tried to ignore it at first, but it kept happening. Again and again. Each repetition seemed to stretch the boundaries of what I thought was possible. The same argument with a colleague, the same passing glance from a stranger, the same creaking of the door as I entered my apartment. It was maddening. And then, one evening, something changed. Something snapped. I woke up, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I didn't recognize the world around me. The room was different. The furniture wasn't where I had left it. The floor was colder, the walls seemed to breathe. The shadows in the corners of the room, they moved. I could hear them, skittering against the walls, whispering things I couldn't understand. The air was dense, suffocating. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The walls closed in, the air seemed to thicken around me. I stumbled backwards, my chest tightening. I thought I was dreaming, but I wasn't. This wasn't a dream. The phone rang. It was the same phone call. The same exact phone call I had received the day before. The voice on the other end, my mother, asked the same question. Are you okay? You seem distant, Adam. I didn't respond. My mind was spinning. I was sinking into something I couldn't escape. The world was splitting. The cracks were deepening. Time had started to rip itself apart like a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a different reality. I could feel the pull, the weight of all those moments repeating, stacking on top of each other like an endless layer of sand. The world was folding in on itself, collapsing into an abyss where nothing was certain. And then, something else happened. The whispers. They stopped. For just a brief moment, there was silence. Perfect, cold silence. But I knew that whatever was happening, it was just beginning. The cracks in time had only started to spread. And I wasn't sure if I would be able to hold on to what little reality I had left. But was this real? I couldn't tell anymore. The silence didn't last long. It was a cold silence, the kind that presses against your chest like a weight you can't shake off. For a few moments, I sat there, on the edge of my bed, staring at the walls that seemed to pulse. It felt as if the very structure of my apartment was alive, breathing with me, or perhaps against me. I couldn't explain it, couldn't even grasp the enormity of what was happening. Time had always felt linear before. Each second, each minute, each hour, neatly ordered and predictable. But now, every second felt like it had been stretched, torn apart, then stitched back together, yet something didn't fit. The moments, they overlapped, collided. I'd catch glimpses of things that didn't make sense, like shadows twisting in unnatural shapes or objects appearing out of the corner of my eye, only to vanish when I turned my head. And always, the sense of repetition, the gnawing feeling that everything was beginning again, in some twisted loop I couldn't escape. I stood up, trembling, and walked to the window, pulling aside the blinds. Outside, the city looked the same, familiar, safe. Yet, there was a sense of wrongness, as though the world itself was slightly out of focus, like the edges of everything were blurring. The streetlights flickered again. It wasn't the first time it had happened that night, but it felt different. The flickering wasn't just random, it was rhythmic, almost as though it was counting down to something. Or warning me. The street below seemed emptier than usual, the air too still. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise as a strange unease settled deep in my stomach. I needed to get out. I needed to get away from that apartment, away from that feeling. But where would I go? I couldn't even remember if I had left the apartment in the last day or two. The confusion was setting in deeper now, and the walls seemed to be closing in on me. It was only then, as I turned away from the window, that I noticed something new, something that shouldn't have been there. A clock, hanging on the wall. It was the same clock that had always been there, but now the hands were moving backwards. At first, I thought I was seeing things. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, it was still the same, moving backwards, the seconds ticking away in reverse. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my throat felt tight, as if the air had thickened around me. Was I losing my mind? The walls felt closer now. The room seemed to be constricting, the edges of my vision darkening as though shadows were creeping along the floor. I stumbled toward the clock, unsure of what I was doing, but drawn to it as though it were some kind of anchor to reality. I reached for it, but just as my hand brushed against the cold surface of the glass, everything went silent again. I stood there, frozen, trying to collect myself. My heartbeat was too loud, the only sound in the room. And then, the whisper. It came again, just like before. My name. Adam. It was soft, so soft that at first I wondered if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But no, this time it was closer. Much closer. The voice was coming from the other side of the room, from the dark corner where the shadows seemed to be thickening. What the hell was going on? I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The corner was empty. The shadows, however, weren't. There was something there, something moving. It wasn't a person, it was something else. Something wrong. My breath caught in my throat as I watched in horror. It wasn't just that the shadows were shifting, it was as if they were alive, twisting, contorting into shapes that didn't belong. I couldn't look away, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. The room felt colder now, the air thick with something unnameable. And then, just as quickly as it began, the shadows stopped. The room returned to its normal state, the walls no longer pressing in on me, the air no longer suffocating. But the feeling, it lingered. That weight, that heaviness in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to leave. I had to leave. But when I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grasped the knob, something stopped me. The same sound, the same clicking noise. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder. The sound of something mechanical, like a gear turning, something spinning in place. And then, I realized, it was the sound of time itself breaking. The clock on the wall. It wasn't moving backwards anymore, it had stopped entirely. And I felt it. The air itself seemed to snap, like a taut rope fraying at the edges. I backed away from the door, my pulse quickening. There was no escape. I turned to face the room again, to see the same walls, the same furniture, the same dim light hanging overhead, but something was different. I couldn't place it, but everything was wrong. The walls felt further away now, as though they had stretched, or maybe I had shrunk. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, paralyzed by my own confusion. Minutes? Hours? Time no longer made sense. It felt as if it had become fluid. I had no control over it. The moments kept splintering, breaking off, colliding, merging into new, fractured seconds. How long had I been in this room? I took a step forward, then another, my body moving on its own, guided by some instinct I didn't understand. I was drawn to the corner, the place where the shadows had been, but now the space was empty. But even though there was nothing there, I could still feel it. The presence. The thing. And just like that, I knew. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for a long time. Time wasn't just repeating, it was changing. And I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't breathe. Not from fear, not from panic, but because I didn't know I was breathing anymore. The air felt thicker than it had just moments ago, a heaviness pressing in on my chest, suffocating me with its weight. I glanced around, desperate for something to anchor me, some point of stability. But there was nothing. Everything had shifted. The clock on the wall had frozen. The same strange clicking noise continued, like the gears of the universe were grinding to a halt, one click at a time. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I wasn't sure if the room had actually shifted, or if it was just me. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus, but the images around me seemed to blur, like I was seeing through a fog. The walls felt far away again, but they weren't. I had just moved. My own body had taken a step back, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. My hand was still trembling as it gripped the doorknob, yet when I tried to twist it, the door wouldn't budge. I tugged harder, panic beginning to take root. The door wouldn't open. It was as if it had become part of the wall, melded with the frame. I pounded on it, desperate to break free from this suffocating room. But no sound came from my fists against the wood. I stepped back, my chest tightening with each breath, the pressure in the room building. And that's when I saw it again. In the corner. The shadows. They were moving. Not like before. This time, they were shifting, stretching, curling, twisting, as if they were being pulled from some invisible force. There was no tangible figure, no face, no body. Just dark, shapeless forms that defied the laws of physics, bending and warping in ways I couldn't comprehend. I took another step back. I had to get out. But the room, no, the space itself, was changing. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable, like I wasn't standing on solid ground. The walls stretched outward, pulling farther away. The ceiling seemed to be rising, and with it, the lights began to flicker again, this time faster, like stuttering breaths. What was happening? The whispers returned, this time louder. But there was more than one voice. More than two. It was a chorus of voices, all overlapping, speaking over one another in a language that I couldn't understand. The words twisted and bent, fragments of sentences crashing together like a dissonant song. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The air was thick, suffocating. Every breath felt like it was clogged with the sound of the whispering voices. I felt my mind slipping away, thoughts becoming more fractured, like pieces of a shattered mirror, scattered and out of reach. And then it all stopped. Silence. The tension in the air vanished. For a fleeting moment, the room was still, peaceful even. I almost believed that everything had been a figment of my imagination, that I'd somehow dreamed it all. But when I glanced up, the clock was still frozen. The walls had moved back to their original position. The shadows in the corner were still there, hovering, watching. I couldn't escape it. Whatever this was, it had me. I stumbled backward, my legs weak. I needed to get out. I needed to run, but where? There was no escape from this, no way to break the cycle. No way to fix what had already broken. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to focus, trying to remind myself of what was real. I had to be rational. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The stress from the job, the sleepless nights, this was just some twisted side effect of my exhaustion, right? But as I opened my eyes again, the shadows moved. They had grown, stretched out farther across the walls, their form no longer subtle but unmistakably there. They seemed to pulse, as if alive, breathing in rhythm with my own heart. A cold chill ran down my spine, and that's when I realized the walls weren't just moving. They were breathing, too. The very room was alive, shifting with every breath I took. The shadows were feeding off it, growing stronger with every passing second. And then, just like that, the air seemed to shift again, turning colder, denser. I felt like I was suffocating, unable to move, unable to think. I was trapped in my own mind, surrounded by things that couldn't exist but were all too real. A sharp crack echoed through the room. The sound came from the far corner, and for a split second, I thought the very fabric of reality had torn open. The shadows stretched higher, and the air became even thicker, the weight on my chest unbearable. Then the room seemed to fold. I wasn't sure how it happened, but I found myself standing somewhere else. The apartment was still there, but it wasn't. The furniture had moved. The walls weren't the same. The space was warped, everything shifted. The very angles of the room had changed, disorienting me further. My heart raced. My mind was racing faster. Was this happening again? I felt my legs give way beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor. My hands trembled as I reached for the wall to steady myself, only to find that the surface wasn't solid anymore. It was soft, like flesh. The walls were breathing. No, this wasn't possible. I tried to scream again, but nothing came out. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices swirling around me, drowning me in their constant, relentless noise. My hands shook, my thoughts scattered. I felt my grip on reality slipping with every passing moment. And then, I realized everything I had been experiencing wasn't just time breaking. It was reality itself, twisting and warping, bending until it couldn't hold its shape anymore. I wasn't just stuck in a loop. I was trapped in a fracturing world. And I had no idea how to escape. I couldn't tell how long I had been lying there, frozen on the floor. The world around me was twisting, unraveling at the seams, as if the very foundations of reality were cracking like brittle glass. I blinked, each time hoping that when I opened my eyes, everything would be back to normal, that I could find some shred of sanity in the chaos. But when I opened them again, the walls, the flesh-like walls, had closed and even more. They were pulsating now, as if alive, breathing, pushing in on me with an intensity one couldn't comprehend. My breaths came in ragged gasps, my pulse quickening with every second I spent within this suffocating space. It wasn't just the walls. The floor beneath me seemed to shift with each step I took, its surface rippling as though it were some kind of liquid. And the whispers, oh God, the whispers, they were louder, more urgent, echoing through my skull like 1,000 voices shouting at once. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me now, worming its way deep into my thoughts, gnawing at my very sanity. I had to move. I had to get out of here. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling beneath me. I was dizzy, lightheaded, the room spinning around me like an out-of-control carousel. I had no idea which direction I was supposed to go. There were no windows, no doors that would lead me to safety. Everything was wrong. The shadows, still in the far corners, had grown darker, more pronounced. I could feel them watching me, crawling ever closer. It wasn't just the walls that were alive, it was everything. The very air seemed to be closing in on me, suffocating me with its unnatural presence. I stumbled toward the kitchen, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could find something to ground me. A knife. A weapon. Anything to make sense of this madness. As I stepped into the kitchen, the fluorescent lights above flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. My reflection in the window was distorted, not quite my own. The face staring back at me looked different. Hollow eyes, pale skin. I quickly turned away, the sight too much to bear. I grabbed a knife from the counter, the cold steel in my hand a small comfort amidst the madness. But even as I held it, I could feel my grip weakening. What was the point? What was I supposed to do with a knife when the world itself was coming apart? Suddenly, the floor beneath me trembled. Not in the way of an earthquake, but with a deep, unsettling thrum, like the ground itself was groaning under some unseen weight. I looked down, my heart skipping a beat as the surface began to crack. The cracks spread like lightning, jagged lines appearing in the wood. Beneath those cracks, a faint, glowing light pulsed. It was like the very core of the earth itself was beginning to leak through. The air thickened, the whispers intensifying, rising to a fever pitch as if they were warning me, urging me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. I couldn't turn back. Not now. The walls were pressing in closer. The kitchen felt smaller, the space shrinking until it became a cage. I couldn't think straight anymore. My mind was splintering. Each thought, each memory, felt distant, fading away as if it had never existed. It was like I was losing myself, piece by piece. I could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. How much of this was in my head? The lights above flickered again, the shadows stretching longer and darker until they completely swallowed the kitchen. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something, someone moving in the corner of the room. A figure, tall and distorted, shifting like smoke, its features obscured by the darkness. I gasped, stumbling back, my grip on the knife tightening. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? The figure stepped forward, its movement jerky, unnatural. It was as though it didn't belong here. It shouldn't have been here, but there it was, inching closer with every breath I took. It was in my head. It had to be. My heart hammered in my chest, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. To escape. But where? How? There was nowhere to go. I raised the knife, my hands trembling, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. I couldn't think, couldn't process. I was lost. Trapped. The figure came closer, its movements grotesque and fluid, like it was made of liquid darkness, shifting and oozing. I could see the faint outline of a face now, twisted and contorted, with eyes that were blacker than the void. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out, just more of those whispers, louder now, deafening. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but it didn't work. The whispers, the figure, they were inside me, inside my head. I couldn't escape them. The world seemed to bend around me, warping with each passing second. The walls, the floors, the very air, it was all twisting, all falling apart, and I was being pulled along with it. I could feel it. I could feel myself slipping. And then it stopped. The room went silent. The figure was gone. The walls had stopped breathing. The cracks in the floor had healed, as if nothing had ever happened. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I could still hear the whispers in my ears, echoing louder than before, surrounding me, pulling me deeper into the void. I was losing myself. Slowly, but surely. And it felt like I was the one who was breaking. I backed away from the spot where the figure had been, the knife still clutched in my hand. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I didn't know what was real. But I knew one thing for certain, I was not alone in this house anymore. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. The silence now seemed heavier than the whispers had ever been, an unbearable weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. My legs shook beneath me, each movement slow and deliberate, as if the floor itself were unwilling to let me leave. But what choice did I have? Where could I go? I glanced around the kitchen again, half expecting the shadows to come alive or for the figure to reappear from the dark corners. But nothing. The place looked ordinary. Almost too ordinary. The countertop was cluttered with the usual things, coffee mugs, a half-eaten sandwich, an old receipt. But nothing about it felt right anymore. The walls, once pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm, now stood still and indifferent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I could feel it, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for me to blink. I looked down at my hands, still gripping the knife like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. But was it? Was I still in reality? The cracks in the floor, the whispers, the shadows, all of it felt like it had been real, but then it all stopped, like a switch had been flipped. A part of me wanted to believe it had been a hallucination, a product of my mind shattering under the pressure. But I couldn't deny the fear that gripped me now, the gnawing suspicion that something much worse was at play here. Something I didn't understand. I set the knife down on the counter, trying to steady myself, trying to think clearly. My mind was racing, struggling to piece together what had happened. Every time I tried to focus, it felt like the world shifted just out of reach, slipping through my fingers like sand. And then, I heard it again, the sound of something moving. It was faint at first, just a barely audible scrape of fabric against the floor, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through my chest. I froze, eyes darting around the kitchen, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was here, inside the house. Inside my head. It wasn't just one sound anymore. There were footsteps now, moving steadily, pacing back and forth, just on the edge of my hearing. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel the presence of something nearby. Something watching me, something waiting. My heart hammered in my chest, the rhythm matching the footfalls, as if the very beat of my life was syncing with the growing tension in the room. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't going to let fear control me again. I couldn't. But how could I not be afraid? What if I was losing my mind? What if the world around me wasn't real at all? The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more suffocating than before. I strained my ears, hoping to hear some clue, some sign that I wasn't alone in this house. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. The shadows crept closer, thickening, deepening as the light from the kitchen flickered in and out, as if the house itself was fighting against the natural flow of time and space. I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I had to leave. I turned toward the front door, but before I could take a step, the sound of a door creaking open behind me made me stop dead in my tracks. My blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Someone, or something, was in the house with me, and they had entered through the front door. I swallowed hard, the knot in my throat threatening to choke me. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen to the spot, as if the ground itself had taken root in my feet. And then it came. A low, guttural growl, the kind of noise no human should ever make, echoed through the hallway. It was followed by a faint scraping sound, nails dragging across the floorboards, slow and deliberate. Something was coming. Something that shouldn't have been here. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see it. But my body moved of its own accord, my neck twisting, my eyes snapping to the shadow at the end of the hallway. It was just a figure at first, a vague outline in the darkness. But then it stepped into the dim light of the kitchen, and I froze. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Its skin was stretched too thin, its eyes wide and black, like hollow pits, absorbing all the light around it. Its mouth was unnaturally wide, too wide, with jagged teeth glistening in the low light. And its hands were twisted, elongated, with sharp claws that clicked against the floor with every step it took. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the fear it could sense radiating from me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted in place, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel its intentions, crawling through my skin, settling deep into my bones. It wasn't here to talk. It wasn't here to ask questions. It was here to take. I took a step back, my foot slipping on the now slick floor. The shadows were getting thicker, suffocating. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to faint. But I couldn't. I couldn't let myself faint, not while it was standing right there. And then, I felt it. A shift in the air, a change that sent a ripple of cold through me. The whispers from earlier, the ones I thought had stopped, were back. They were louder now, more insistent. They surrounded me, pressing on me from all sides. The figure took another step forward. I had no more time. I could feel it. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. My heart pounded in my ears, and I knew that there was no escaping this thing. No way out. But there had to be. There had to be. With a last, desperate push, I moved. My legs carried me forward, the knife still in my hand, my body screaming in protest. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I didn't know how to stop this thing. But I had to try. I turned, running toward the door, my mind racing. Please, please let me get out of here. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling so violently that I almost missed it. But when I turned the knob, I felt a sickening snap. The door was stuck. It wouldn't budge. And then I heard it again. The sound of claws scraping across the floor. The figure was right behind me. It's hard to pinpoint the moment when everything changed. One minute, the world felt ordinary, and the next, I was drowning in the oppressive weight of the night. I could feel it in the silence, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but heavy, as though the very air was thick with unspoken words. Each tick of the clock seemed louder, sharper, reminding me that time was slipping away, that things I loved, things I once held dear, were quietly being erased. How much longer before everything would be lost? I sat there, staring out the window at the moonlit sky. My apartment, with its familiar corners and worn-out furniture, felt distant. It wasn't the place I knew anymore. There was something wrong in the way the shadows clung to the walls, too thick, too still. I could feel my breath getting shallow, as if the air itself was suffocating me, pulling the very life from my lungs. It wasn't just the stillness that unnerved me. No, it was the subtle things, the way the silence seemed to twist into sounds that didn't belong, faint whispers that grew too clear to ignore. I wasn't alone. It was a thought that chilled me, not because I knew I had company, but because I couldn't understand who or what that company was. I strained my ears, listening. At first, it was just the low hum of the refrigerator, the wind tapping at the window, but then, there it was. A soft, almost imperceptible creaking, as though someone had taken a step on the wooden floor behind me. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. No one should be here. Just the house settling, I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize it. It's nothing. Nothing at all. But the creaking came again. And then, the whisper. Not words, just a sound. A sound like someone, or something, was trying to speak, but it didn't know how to form coherent thoughts. I glanced around, my eyes darting from one darkened corner to the next. There were no shadows that shouldn't be there, no figures lurking in the periphery. But I could feel it. Something was watching me, something ancient and aware, lurking just out of sight. I tried to dismiss the feeling. I had to. I was imagining it. My mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just the stress of the past few months, the loneliness. Maybe it was my own paranoia creeping in. But even as I tried to tell myself that, the sense of unease deepened. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but I could sense the weight of them as if they were pressing against me. I stood up abruptly, my legs shaky beneath me. The apartment, which had always felt like home, now seemed unfamiliar, strange. I moved cautiously toward the hallway, hoping to calm myself, hoping that whatever was happening was just in my head. But the air felt thick, as if it were holding its breath. The familiar hum of my apartment had turned into something darker, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. And then, the sound of footsteps. Not the creaking of the floor, but actual, distinct footsteps, slow and measured, moving across the living room. I felt my pulse race. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but my feet were frozen in place. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but every fiber of my being screamed that it wasn't. I turned, slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The living room was just as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the space. The shadows were deeper now, more pronounced. The air felt colder. I reached for the light switch, but when I flicked it, the light flickered and then died entirely, plunging the room into complete darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But as I grabbed the handle, something froze me in place, a low, guttural growl, deep and throaty, coming from just beyond the threshold. My hand went numb against the doorknob, my body paralyzed by a primal fear I hadn't felt since childhood. The growl was followed by something worse, a whisper. It wasn't a whisper in the sense of words, but something more intimate, like a breath against my ear, hot and foul. The hair on my neck stood on end, and the cold spread through me like ice, sinking deep into my bones. I closed my eyes, trying to center myself, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. But the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, crept over me like a suffocating blanket. I could feel it now, right behind me, breathing in sync with my own shallow breaths. I snapped my eyes open. The room had changed again. It was darker now, impossibly dark. The shadows stretched long across the floor, curling like tendrils. The walls seemed to bend in on themselves, the very fabric of the room warping, as if reality itself were starting to break apart. I took a step back, stumbling as the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. The whispers returned, louder this time, all around me. I couldn't tell if they were real, or if they were just my mind shattering under the weight of everything. There was no more doubt. I wasn't alone. And whatever was in the room with me, whatever was watching me, it wasn't human. I turned toward the hallway, my body moving instinctively now, desperate to escape. But I heard the sound again. Footsteps, closer this time. I couldn't see who it was. I didn't need to. The footsteps weren't human. I didn't know how much longer I could keep my composure. Each breath felt harder to take, each step more desperate. Whatever was in this apartment with me, whatever was lurking in the shadows, it was coming for me. And the worst part? I couldn't tell if it was real. I didn't know what was real anymore. But I knew this much. I had to leave. Before it was too late. I didn't know how long I had been standing there, my back pressed against the door, heart pounding in my chest, sweat dripping down my neck. The sounds, those terrible, unnatural whispers, had faded, but the silence that followed felt even worse. It was suffocating. I could feel my pulse in my ears, loud and frantic, like it was trying to drown out the dread that clung to me like a second skin. I forced myself to move. My legs trembled, but I couldn't stay frozen any longer. The apartment, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a maze designed to trap me. It felt as though the walls themselves were pressing in on me, constricting my every movement. I didn't know where to go. The only thing that felt certain in that moment was that I had to get out, but every exit seemed to mock me. The hallway stretched out before me, its darkness a tangible thing, thick and impenetrable. I didn't want to turn back, but I could feel something behind me, something watching me. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, looming in the doorway. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence and the sense that everything around me was wrong. I stepped forward, my breath shallow and uneven. Each footstep was too loud, too real. Every sound seemed amplified in the dead quiet. The floor creaked beneath me, and I winced, my skin crawling. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the air felt thick, as though every sound I made would be swallowed up by the night. I reached the kitchen, the one place I thought might offer some comfort, something familiar to anchor me. But even here, the room didn't feel right. The refrigerator hummed, but it sounded off-key, as though it were trying to speak in a voice it couldn't quite form. I glanced around, looking for anything that could explain the unsettling tension in the air. But there was nothing. Nothing except the heavy weight of expectation. The sense that something was coming. Something terrible. I grabbed a knife from the counter. It felt flimsy in my hand, a pitiful weapon against whatever horror was creeping through the shadows. But I clung to it, feeling the cold metal in my grasp like a fragile promise of safety. The blade gleamed in the dim light, a fleeting reminder that I still had control, that I wasn't completely lost to this madness. I turned back toward the living room. The door to the hallway was closed, and I had no intention of going back that way. But the apartment felt different now. The walls weren't just closing in, they were shifting, warping. The familiar space seemed like a distorted reflection of itself, as if reality was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. Every object in the room, each chair, each lamp, looked wrong. The way they cast shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, the way the air felt colder in certain spots, the flickering light above. It was as if the room was breathing, as if it were alive. I could feel the floor beneath me begin to vibrate, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. The sound, no, the sensation, was almost like a distant rumble, but it was so much deeper, as though the very foundation of the building was shifting. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Was the building going to collapse? Was this just a bad dream? I didn't want to wait to find out. I had to get out. I had to run. I turned back toward the hallway, but my feet felt like they were stuck in molasses. I couldn't move. Every part of me screamed to escape, but my body refused to obey. And then, footsteps. Not the distant, echoing ones I had heard before, but heavy, deliberate, closing in fast. I whipped around, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. The living room was empty, but I could feel something moving, something shifting in the air. A shadow. No, it wasn't a shadow. It was a presence, something alive, something moving through the space. I took a step back, my grip tightening around the knife. My legs shook, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. I tried to make sense of it, tried to force myself to think logically. But the terror was too much, too overwhelming. And then I saw it. It wasn't a figure in the traditional sense, not something I could name or describe with any certainty. It was more like a distortion in the air, a dark shape that seemed to stretch and twist, bending at unnatural angles. It wasn't quite solid, but it was there, unmistakably there, hanging in the space just beyond my vision, like a hole in the fabric of reality itself. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. My breath hitched, my body trembling with the intensity of the moment. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. I spun around, not caring what direction I was running in, just needing to escape that presence, that thing that seemed to be hunting me. My feet pounded against the floor, but it felt as if the ground itself were pulling me back, trying to hold me in place, to keep me there. The hallway stretched out before me, a long, dark tunnel. The light flickered, barely illuminating the path ahead, but I didn't care. I ran faster, desperate to get away, desperate to escape the nightmare that was closing in on me. And then I heard it, an unmistakable sound that froze me in place. A voice. But it wasn't a human voice. It wasn't even a language I could comprehend. It was a low, growling hum, like a sound from the depths of the earth, the kind of noise you would hear in the darkest nightmares, a sound that rattled your very bones. I turned, unable to stop myself, and there it was. The shape, now clearer, more defined. It was a grotesque figure, an abomination that seemed to defy all logic. Its limbs were twisted, broken in ways that should have been impossible, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, burned with a cold, malevolent light. I stood frozen, the knife hanging uselessly at my side. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure moved toward me, its movements jerky, as though it were learning how to walk. But there was no mistaking its intent. It was coming for me, and there was nowhere to hide. I wanted to scream. I needed to scream. But the sound caught in my throat, choked by an overwhelming, suffocating pressure that seemed to close in around me. Every instinct told me to run, to break free from the suffocating grip of fear that had taken hold of my body. Yet I remained paralyzed. My legs felt like lead, and no matter how hard I willed them to move, they refused to obey. The creature, it wasn't just a thing. It was a force, an absence of everything I understood, and the closer it came, the more the space around me warped and bent. The walls seemed to stretch, the air itself rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. I could hear it now, that low, guttural hum growing louder, vibrating through my bones. I could feel it in my chest, an oppressive weight that seemed to crush the air from my lungs. Every part of me screamed that this wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind spun, grasping at logic, trying to make sense of this nightmare. But there was no sense to be made. This thing, this being, was beyond comprehension. It shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. And yet it did. And it was coming for me. The shadows around me seemed to grow longer, more aggressive, as if the very darkness was alive, closing in, reaching out for me with invisible fingers. I felt it before I saw it, the cold that settled in the air, thick and unnatural, a chill that sank into my bones. It was coming closer, and I was running out of time. I had to move. I had to escape. But then, something stopped me. The creature had paused, its grotesque shape now standing motionless in the hallway. It was almost like it was studying me, sensing my fear, savoring my panic. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't after my body, it was after something far worse. It was after my soul. I couldn't understand why or how, but I felt it deep in my core. This thing was a predator, but not for flesh. It fed on something far more precious. My entire being, my thoughts, my memories, they were all being stripped away, piece by piece. I could feel it crawling through my mind, its presence invasive and suffocating, wrapping its cold fingers around my consciousness. My thoughts were growing dull, sluggish, like trying to think through a fog. What do you want from me? I thought, the words almost escaping my mind. I didn't know if I was speaking aloud or if the thought was forming inside me, but I felt the answer. Everything. The figure jerked, its limbs cracking and stretching unnaturally, as though it was shifting in and out of time. Its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed now, an unnatural, burning red that pierced through the dark. They weren't just eyes, they were holes, emptiness staring into the depths of my soul. I couldn't look away. I tried, but the pull of its gaze was irresistible, dragging me deeper into its orbit, like a moth to an unseen flame. The air seemed to hum with its power, and the closer it got, the more my sense of reality dissolved. The edges of the room blurred. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching on like an eternity. I tried to lift the knife again, but my hand trembled uncontrollably, the weapon slipping from my fingers as though it had no weight, no substance. I was powerless. The fear had taken my strength, had stripped away any hope of escape. It was closing in now, its form solidifying, twisting into something more terrifying. The shadows around it seemed to writhe, the room itself starting to bend and crack, as if the very foundation of my reality was breaking apart at the seams. I backed away, my feet sliding against the floor, but I wasn't getting any further. The space was shrinking, pulling me in, and the creature, no, the thing, was coming closer. I felt it, a suffocating wave of despair washing over me, erasing everything I had ever known, every memory, every hope. My vision swam, and I stumbled, nearly collapsing to the ground. The pressure in the room increased tenfold, and I gasped for air, but it was as though I couldn't breathe anymore. The world was collapsing on me, and there was no escape. Then, just as I thought I could take no more, something snapped. A deep, unsettling crack echoed through the room, and the walls, once solid, began to ripple, as if they were no longer made of the same material. The air itself trembled, as though the universe itself was beginning to tear at the edges. I turned, panicking, my body screaming for release, but there was nowhere to go. I had no direction, no place to hide. The thing was everywhere. It wasn't just in front of me, it was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air I was breathing. It was inside me. The whispering began again. It was no longer a distant hum, no longer a faint whisper. It was right beside me, close enough that I could feel it in my ears. It was saying something. Words. Words I couldn't understand, but they touched me. They found me. This is the end. The words lingered in the air, heavy, inevitable. The weight of them crushed me, pressed down on me like an iron fist. This was it. There was no escape. The last thing I saw before everything collapsed into darkness was the creature's eyes, burning with that cold, red light. And then, there was nothing. I don't know how long I was gone. Seconds, minutes, hours, time had become an abstract concept, slipping through my mind like water through clenched fingers. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't sure if I was still alive. The void that had swallowed me felt endless, as though I was caught between worlds, neither here nor there. Everything was still. A deep, suffocating silence pressed in around me. I could feel it, heavy and thick, as though it were alive, watching, waiting. But for what? I didn't dare move. The sensation of being watched was undeniable now. It was like a weight on my chest, pushing me down, suffocating me. Every breath felt strained, labored. I was in a place I couldn't comprehend, a place where nothing made sense, where the fabric of reality itself had started to unravel. I blinked again. The room, if that's what it was unfamiliar, cold. It looked like a distorted version of my own apartment, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling in places, but it was the air, the atmosphere, that was most unsettling. The room was still, but the space felt wrong, as though the very essence of it had been distorted by something far greater than mere physical change. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy. My limbs were unresponsive, as though they no longer belonged to me. The weight of exhaustion had settled deep within my bones, but it was more than that. It was something deeper. My mind was thick with fog, and each attempt to move only left me feeling more disconnected. Was this real? The question lingered in the air. Was this some sort of nightmare? Had I finally gone mad, lost my grip on reality? The rational part of me tried to cling to the idea that it was all just in my head, a dream that would fade with the light of day. But the part of me that could still feel, the part that was terrified, knew the truth. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't just some hallucination. I was trapped in something far worse. The hum was back, faint at first, barely audible. But it was there. I felt it before I heard it, a vibration in the air, a pulse that throbbed through the room. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but it was felt. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to locate the source of the noise. It was close. Too close. The walls, the very space around me, seemed to bend and twist, as if they were made of some liquid substance that refused to settle into a solid form. The faint crackling sounds grew louder, the hum turning into a low, guttural growl. The room was alive, and it was closing in on me. I swallowed hard, but the fear in my throat left me dry, like I couldn't breathe, like I was drowning in the very air itself. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I felt the sweat dripping down my back, cold and sticky. Stop, I whispered to myself, my voice barely a breath. It's not real. It's not real. But deep down, I knew I was lying. The creature wasn't gone. It wasn't finished. I could feel it in the air, in the walls, in the very pulse of this place. It was here. It was always here. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping the room in desperation, searching for any sign of an exit, some way out. But there was nothing. Just shadows. Shifting, writhing shadows that seemed to move on their own, as though the darkness itself had come alive. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, a figure. A shape, barely visible in the dim light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a figment of my tired eyes. But no, this was real. I could feel it. The figure shifted, its movements unnatural, fluid in a way that made my stomach turn. It was tall, thin, its limbs too long, almost skeletal. Its face, was a blur, a mass of shadows that writhed and stretched as though it were trying to form into something more solid. And its eyes. Those eyes, two pits of endless, black voids. They locked onto mine, and I felt the air leave my lungs, my heart seizing in my chest. There was nothing human about it. Nothing that made sense. It was the source. The source of the darkness. The source of everything that was falling apart in my world. A whisper echoed in my mind. Not words. No, not words. Just a presence, a knowing that seeped into me. I couldn't make sense of it, but I could feel it. It was too much, too overwhelming. It's coming for you. The words were not spoken aloud. No, they came from me. I felt them in my mind, my soul, as though my very being was being invaded. I gasped, stumbling back, but I couldn't move fast enough. The shadows closed in around me, wrapping me in cold, tight coils. My mind screamed for release, but my body was paralyzed. And then, as I was trapped in the dark, the truth hit me. Harder than anything else. There was no escape. This thing, it wasn't just hunting me. It had already won. I couldn't breathe. The weight on my chest, the suffocating darkness, it pressed down on me like a vice. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to escape, but my limbs betrayed me. They refused to move, as if they had turned to stone. My heart raced, pounding against the cage of my ribs, but the coldness of the shadows around me was unbearable. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, willing myself to wake up. But there was no waking. This wasn't a nightmare, not anymore. The shadows, the whispers, the creeping terror, they were all real. Too real. More real than anything I had ever known. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming silence that surrounded me. There was no sound except for the low hum, the same pulse that had been there from the beginning. It felt like the very rhythm of the world, something ancient, unyielding. The hum seemed to resonate deep in my bones, vibrating through my entire body. And then, the figure, the creature, stepped closer. Its elongated limbs scraped against the walls, dragging a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and its body stretched and shifted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It loomed over me, the black void of its eyes consuming everything in its path. I felt the pull of its gaze, like a gravity well, drawing me in, pulling me closer to the darkness it embodied. Its presence was suffocating. I could feel my mind shattering under the weight of its existence. Every thought, every rational thought, was being swallowed by it, devoured by the unrelenting abyss that surrounded me. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like the wind howling through a cracked window. A voice that wasn't quite a voice, but something more ancient, more primal. It wasn't speaking directly to me, or at least, not in the way I understood language. It was feeding me thoughts, emotions, memories. Things that weren't mine. Things that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they drowned out everything else. But there was one thought that stood out, clearer than all the rest. "You are nothing." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through my very soul. I felt my sense of self crumbling, breaking apart like a glass figurine shattered into 1,000 pieces. The more I tried to fight it, the harder it became to hold on to myself. My very identity, everything I had been, everything I was, slipped through my fingers, dissolving into the air like dust. I tried to stand, tried to push myself up from the floor, but my body refused. I was pinned, anchored to this place. The darkness, the creature, it had rooted me here, where there was no escape, no hope. My breath came in shallow gasps, but it didn't help. The air felt thick, choking me, suffocating me. And then it touched me. Its cold, clammy fingers brushed against my face, and the shock of it sent a jolt of terror through me. The sensation was wrong. It wasn't a touch, it was a breach. It felt like something inside me was being violated, torn apart. My thoughts, my memories, everything that made me who I was, it was all being consumed. I struggled, but my limbs remained frozen, unresponsive. The creature's presence invaded my mind completely, and I felt as though I were falling into an endless abyss, deeper and deeper with no end in sight. And then, as if to punctuate my despair, I felt it, the moment I truly understood. The creature wasn't just an entity. It was a force. A force that had been here all along, a part of the world itself, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it could finally break through. And it wasn't just here to consume me. It had come to consume everything. It was the end. The end of everything I had known. The end of the world as I had understood it. The end of all things, all people, all places. All that had been and all that was to come. And I was nothing more than a fleeting thought to it. It didn't care about me. It didn't care about my struggle or my fear. It didn't care about anything. It was inevitable. I felt myself slipping, my grip on reality dissolving like sand in the wind. The world around me blurred, twisted, warped until nothing made sense anymore. Time no longer existed. There was no space. No beginning. No end. Just this. The hum. The pulse. The cold, empty void. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the creature was gone. The walls stopped shifting. The air no longer vibrated with that low hum. But in its place, there was only silence. Complete silence. I didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes, hours, days, it was impossible to tell. Everything felt suspended, frozen. The darkness still clung to me, but there was no creature anymore. There was no sound. No movement. I stood up, unsure of where I was or what I had just experienced. I felt empty. Hollow. As though something had been torn from me, something vital that could never be returned. My mind felt fragile, like it was a glass, cracking under the pressure of everything I had just lived through. But I wasn't sure if it had truly happened. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was all in my head. After all, there was nothing left now, just the silence. Was it real? Or had I finally cracked? The uncertainty gnawed at me. But as I took one last look around, I realized one thing. There was no escaping it. The world had shifted. The truth had been revealed. And nothing would ever be the same again. Not for me. Not for anyone. We had all been touched by the darkness. And now, we were all lost. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.